Dobrodošli na Institut za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju. Danas otvaramo ovaj deo radionice New Urban Living Rooms prvim predavanjem koje će održati Snežana, Vesnić i Marko Ristić sa Arhitektonskog fakulteta sa temom On the Second Analog Space. Samo bih zamolila ljude sa Zooma da nam kažu da li nas čuju i vide.
Čujemo, odlično čujemo.
Super, hvala vam, uživajte.
Čujemo svi, super.
Izvolite.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending this lecture. Before we start, we would like to thank Manuel for the initiative of this workshop to be organized. We especially thank Strad Association for the organization, as well for the invitation for the Institute to support the workshop. With these lectures, you will have the opportunity to hear today and the next 2 days. As you can see in the current slide, the lecture we will give today is titled On the Second Analog Space. In this lecture, we will try to reconstruct the theme of the workshop on a conceptual level by problematizing the return to the analog, which we experience in post-pandemic times. We will introduce the concept of the second analog space in order to grasp the radical structural change in our experience of the analog through the digital, since today the digital, particularly in architecture, ceases to be conceptually understood in the terms of radical otherness.
Since the workshop deals with the consequences of the pandemic, we would like to show you an artwork that seems to us to be a good introduction to the conceptual problems we will talk about today. This is the Lithuanian Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Art Biennale. It is an opera performance called Sun and Sea Marina, organized by the Nida Art Colony of Vilnius Academy of Arts and curated by Lucia Pietrojusti. The pavilion transformed the interior of a quayside building into a summer beach scene. I will now read the Vilnius Academy of Arts description of the performance. With a bird's eye view of the performance from a mezzanine gallery above the stage, audiences look down on the assembled characters who appear as a typical group of holiday goers of varying ages from different walks of life, attired in colorful bathing suits and sunbathing under the full glare of the sun over a mosaic of towels. Surveying this fleshy tableau vivant from their sun-like vantage point, audiences observe the frailty of the human condition. As the libretto unfolds, we are introduced to each individual in turn through sung performances that reveal private preoccupations ranging from trivial concerns about sunburn and plans for future vacations to nagging fears of environmental catastrophe, which surface as though from the depths of the character's troubled consciousness. Frivolous micro-stories on this crowded beach give way to broader, more serious topic and grow into a global symphony, a universal human choir addressing planetary scale issues. Tired bodies offering a metonym for a tired planet. End of quote. So taken as an allegory of the human condition, this performance is intriguing since it raises the question of shifting from a purely individual position to not so much the collective as such, but rather to the one we would call meta-individual. The meta-individual position would be that which involves the idea of the ecological conditionedness of an individual. The Lithuanian Pavilion was opened with a talk with Daisy Hildyard, author of the non-fiction book The Second Body. Aside from the fact that the body relates to the performance in the way it deals with the problem of Anthropocene, we wanted to mention it primarily because of its provocative title. By the second body, Hildyard means the body whose boundaries are being destabilized with the presence of life traditionally considered the other.
Okay. We will begin with the essay of Jean-François Lyotard entitled Can Thought Go On Without a Body? Beyond any metaphysics, this question is related to the problem of the physical end, the end of the world. Lyotard emphasizes the end of the world by definition implies the end of philosophy, that is, the end of questioning, which constitutes human thought. In this sense, it is possible to think an end, pure and simple, of anything at all, since the end's a limit to think if you have to be on the both sides of that limit. So what's finished or finite has to be perpetuated in our thought if it is to be thought of as of finished. We begin with the problem of the end due to its importance for the architectural discourse. Architects intuitively identify with this philosophical problem since what they do over and over again is bringing something to the end, a material end. There is a common architectural term, situation, by which the philosopher Martin Heidegger explains the original meaning of the word end. In the essay, The End of Philosophy, he says, I quote, "The old meaning of the word end means the same as place. From one end to other means from one place to the other. The end of philosophy is the place in which the whole of philosophy's history is gathered in its most extreme possibility. And as completion means this gathering," end of quote. In Lyotard's view, being an ultimate event, the possible end of the world becomes entirely subjective. But by the end of the world, Lyotard does not mean the disappearance of the entire material world, but only the terrestrial world, the world in which human life could exist. Therefore, his question is directed toward reaching the life of mind beyond its being conditioned by the body. This is where Lyotard introduced the problem of how artificial intelligence could replace human thought. The problem is completely based on the analog-digital distinction, where the analogy of the human thought always evades the executive of the digital. In order to better understand the relationship between these two completely different ways of conceiving reality, we will first present several theories of the analog and then try to define the concept of the digital regarding its particularities within the architectural discourse.
Originally, the term analog belonged to mathematics, from where it was borrowed by Greek grammarians. Greek analogous, which means proportionate, became Latin analogus, with the meaning proportionate according to due proportion, from ana, throughout according to, and logo, which means ratio or proportion. And this was meant that which corresponds with another, resembling in nature, structure, or function. In a logic, analogy means an argument from the similarity of things, in some ways inferring their similarity in others. We also encounter definitions in which analogy is a comparison between two objects or systems of objects that highlights respects in which they are thought to be similar. In the book, Typical Forms and Special Ends in Creation, McCosh speaks of analogies of function. Quote, by an analog is meant an organ in one animal having the same function as a different organ in a different animal. The difference between homolog and analog may be illustrated by the wing of a bird and that of a butterfly. As the two totally differ in anatomical structure, they cannot be said to be homologous, but they are analogous in function since they both serve for flight. End of quote. Similarly, in logic, the term analogous has a single signification that applies with equal propriety to more than one object, as in the leg of a table and a leg of an animal. To illustrate the complexity of the notion of the analog, we will shortly present the three interpretations of it we have chosen as those of great potential for architectural conceptualization of the qualities of the analog. The first one is the mathematical concept. So proportionality as a basic characteristic of the analog in mathematics draws its origin from quotienta, which means number of times one quantity is contained in another, from Latin quotiens, which means how often, how many times, as often as, from quot, which means how many. Simply, it is a relation that describes division of two numbers. However, when a division of two numbers is represented at once, it also requires defining the difference or relation of two bodies according to one another, as well as to the whole. In any case, the mathematical interpretation of relationship between relationships can be transformed into resemblance between relationships. Discussing certain figures of speech, in particular analogy and metaphor, the mathematician David Pym points out that they make natural language and give it power, and he identifies comparable processes in mathematics. However, he adds that analogy is not proof but illustration.
The second interpretation could be formulated in this way. Difference is mediated by analogy. Analogy, although it assumes similarity, immediately includes or defines different too. Analogy, the similarity along with difference among meanings, among sorts of thinking, and among realities. Analogy of meaning is not grounded in direct similarity, but a similarity with a difference of semantic relation, especially similarity of constructing relations. The third idea we ground in reading Foucault, that the power of analogy is precisely in connection that are not visible but are really essential and demand subtle similarities. The power of analogy in invisible connection represents the potential to achieve infinitely many relations that may further become expanded, wherein continuity is achieved, but also included in this power is the possibility of creative potential. Further, in Foucault, we saw a fine detail that is achieving the same ends, that we can achieve something in infinity many ways. The analogous hold on the difference. This detail is important for the explanation of possibility of creative work. Constant difference grounded in analogy is actually a freedom of variation in creative processes. Further, analogy and successions allows for connections between one organic structure and another, wherein the identity of one or more elements gives a new identity, surpassing the old identity of relation among elements of the functions they have. This, according to Foucault, means the successions allow for a destiny of analogy. I quote, "The whole volume of the world, all the adjacencies of convenience, all the echoes of emulation, all the linkages of analogy are supported, maintained, doubled by this space governed by sympathy and antipathy, which are ceaselessly drawing things together and holding them apart. By means of this interplay, the world remains identical. resemblances continue to be what they are and to resemble one another. The same remains the same, repeated onto itself. End quote. So these three elaborated ideas of the analogous show that first, the analogous implies infinitely many possibilities or objects. Second, difference is mediated by analogy. And third, analogous preserves difference with the new relation. This interpretation of the analog could be a suitable addition to the description of the essence of the analog in terms of uncertainty, blur, and the fate of inexorability of the perceivable. With the digital, the way we conceived it seems deprived of.
Our intention is to attempt to destabilize traditional concepts of the digital through an architectural discourse, specifically through experimental projects and ideas, starting with the Renaissance and Alberti. Why the digital in architecture? The digital in architecture is present in all elements, engaged proactive in processes of design, as well as the creation of digital tools necessary to reach otherwise unattainable results. In addition, the digital in architecture is always materialized, that is, translated into the analog, primarily the analog space, but also analog philosophy and aesthetics. In other words, the digital in architecture would be specific because it always seeks the return to the analog as its end. The digital is therefore a pure instrument of architectural creation. We first encountered the word digital in the mid-15th century, meaning pertaining to number below 10. It comes from the Latin digitalis, from digitus, which means finger or toe. The numerical sense emerges from numerals under 10 being counted on fingers. The meaning of using numerical digits is from 1938, referring to computers that run on data in the form of digits, as opposed to analog. It is used in reference to recording and broadcasting from 1960. Digital recording or preserving data through a series of ones and zeros, indicating the presence or absence of a signal. Digital signals and objects function in the area of discrete and finite, which means that they have a finite set of values. But following Negroponte, the world in which we live is analog. He says, quote, the emergence of continuity from individual pixels is analogous to a similar phenomenon on a much finer scale in the familiar world of matter. Matter is made of atoms. If you could look at a smoothly polished metal surface at a subatomic scale, you would see mostly holes. It appears smooth and solid because the discrete pieces are so small. Likewise, digital output. But the world, as we experience it, is a very analog place. End quote. From a macroscopic point of view, it is not digital at all, but continuous. Nothing goes suddenly on or off, turns from black to white, or changes from one state to another without going through a transition.
By problematizing what is today analog and digital, we will discuss the digital in architectural production, explaining first that there is always analog in the digital and vice versa, that the digital today does not have a problem of origin, positioning the contemporary concept of the digital as archiving of memory in the architectural project, and the third, suggesting the digital as the complement to the analog in process of creation in architectural design. Case 1. Reversibility of Alberti and the digital in the analog digital. In his brief 15th century text, Descriptio Urbis Romae, Alberti describes the method he developed for drawing the map of Rome, a simple form of surviving, allowing anyone to draw a map of city. The origin point of the observation of Alberti's survey is point 00 in the table, the summit of the capital. The process is essentially very simply. Wires would extend in the air from the point of origin to the point of interest. The distance and angle of measuring are then marked in tables we still have in Alberti's book. Alberti transcribed his measurements in a form that is basically polar coordinates. The survey's map can then be transcribed by anyone in any chosen format. First, the horizon is divided into 48 equal parts, which are called degrees, around the circle any chosen radius. The north is thus given by 48 divisions, south by its 24th, the west is number 36, and the east number 12. Each of these 48 parts is then divided again in 4 equal parts, which are called minutes. This numeric value corresponds to the angle of the polar coordinates in Alberti's survey. In Going Digital, Mario Carpo points out that none of Alberti's 3 famous texts about the image, architecture, and sculpture is illustrated, nor was ever meant to be. Alberti resorted in certain cases to basic geometric diagrams sufficiently simply to be easily reproduced. In other cases, he sought to surpass the corruption of analog images through the digital. He replaced images with a list of numbers and set of computing instructions of algorithms designing to convert a visual image into the digital database, reproducing a copy of the original image as needed. The alphabet, diagram, and algorithm, each of these cultural technologies could somehow replace the offending image, yet each had its shortcomings.
In his writing on a figural sculpture named De Statua, Alberti described his technique of identical copy reproduction of sculptures using traditional tools and basic calculations. First, the artist or copyist takes precise measurements of height, width, and various radii of the sculpture using the appropriate instruments. The main components of the sculpture are measured in numbers and documented, essentially scanned in relation to one another for the entire sculpture. In order to obtain as precise measurements as possible, the sculptor is fitted with a device of his own creation, the definitor or finitorium. Similar to the device used for drawing the map of Rome, the finitorium is a plate engraved with degrees with a mobile arm. Although incredibly slow, it is possible to copy every point of the statue in 3-dimensional space in relation to its central axis. Data obtained can then be sent to a craftsman who can use it to recreate an identical copy of the original statue. This method can be seen as the beginning of 3D printing. A 3D printer processes digital drawings, coordinates set in virtual space, by slicing the model into sufficiently small pieces to be recreated by a machine. These components are layered and connected almost imperceptibly, creating an identical physical reproduction of the original digital model. The difference between 3D printing and Alberti's method is in efficacy only, but the principle is the same. Alberti thought that his high-resolution image would travel better in time and space, encased in a digital database, and that an original map ought to be drawn anew exclusively based on the numerical data, executing the program not through the analog. Alberti's analog digital models showed that there is always translation, transposition, and or morphogenesis of the analog into the digital, as well as the digital into the analog. Paradoxically, this is only more radically visible through contemporary tools, software, and architectural design. Indeed, not only in technical production, but in conceptualization. In design, an architectural object is inevitably digitalized through various conceptual techniques, such as the grid or post-structuring, as well as through the reflection of the concept in the future object.
If you remind within Alberti's technical power of reproduction, the digital problem of origin would be easily resolved. We could simply say that prior to the digital is always the analog. However, the contemporary reality of software and tools, as well as the problem of time and speed, provide entirely novel notion of the origin of the digital. In a chapter of the end of In the Future 2013 that accompanied the eponymous exhibit Archaeology of the Digital, Greg Lynn replaced the qualification of the digital as meaning in the future with the phrase in the recent past. In so doing, he opened new ideas of the digital, the possibility of the archive and archaeology of the digital, reconstruction of its temporal context, as well as the form and function of the digital in archaeological discourse. Lynn's three-part exhibit, Archaeology of the Digital, looked back as far as the late 1980s, when only a few architects will explain digital tools in architectural design. Complexity and convention, a subtle note to Robert Venturi's seminal Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, comprises 25 projects for which digital materials are integral to an understanding of the design process. The archaeology of in Archaeology of the Digital is then a model of exploration that provides the framework needed to inspect archive and projects. The close readings of different media, recordings, professional affiliation, tools, software, and processes offer compelling evidence that history is not seamless, progressive story, but rather an incessantly rewriting narrative modified by new scrutiny.
Each of the four architects included in Lynn's project sought a specific hardware and software, as well as engaged program developers to invent or craft tools necessary for the execution of their vision concept through a digital medium. However, this was not a need for mere translation from the analog into the digital, technical production, or descriptive geometry. Rather, it was a question of opening up possibilities to think through the capacities of the digital that allow first infinitely many variations, inconsistent multiple, and then oversight of the process that transforms the void into solid. For example, Gary's method of turning a wireframe into a solid still remains compatible with his hand drawings. There is a search for a functional geometry and a method that can explain processes in architectural design and lead ultimately to the materialization of the concept into the form of the object. This means that in Eismann's digital drawings we can read philosophical interpretation of Leibniz's monads or Deleuze's rhizome, deconstruction of diagrammatic thinking following Gilles Deleuze, or an even more direct materialization of the concept of genetic picking and coding. All four architects approach the digital media with a conceptual interpretation and intelligence, treating the digital not only as an instrument but a new creative medium and conceptual system integral to their work process and expanding both their design and theory. In such digital twists, institutionalization and temporal and spatial openings to a new order and distance, we find it possible to introduce a novel approach to the realm of the analog. The novelty we would like to suggest is the establishing of an architectural project as an archive or palimpsest of the digital. The architectural project becomes the formation for archiving the past and future, since the architectural project is always oriented towards the future and only superficially, paradoxically, the origin of the project is in the future, even though it is grounded in the archive of the past. In this way, the field of the analog, which has been burdened with the eternal question of origin, is slowly beginning to be destabilized. So if we now go back to Lyotard, we will notice one aspect of his essay which resists the proposed archival and archaeological consideration of the digital. Namely, Lyotard divides his text into two parts, where the first one is titled He, and the second one She. This division aims at defining the lack of some, let's say, ontological difference in the realm of the digital, which could make it ever more incomplete. Lyotard finds this difference in the human body, which he says also affects human mind. However, the eschatological tone in which Lyotard wrote his essay could make us disregard a passage from the beginning of the essay. Quote, "You know, technology wasn't invented by us humans, rather the other way around. As anthropologists and biologists admit, even the simplest life forms are already technical devices. Any material system is technological if it filters information useful to its survival, if it memorizes and processes that information and makes inferences based on the regulating effect or behavior. That is, if it intervenes on and impacts its environment so as to assure its perpetuation at least."
This is an exact explanation of why the digital could, or better still should be taught with the archival work, which covers both the spatial and temporal qualities of the analog world. As in Greg Lynn's translation of a digital from the discourse of future to the discourse of the past, we find in Lyotard the idea of the continuation, which abandons the idea of irreducible difference between the digital and the analog, that instead proposes the idea of memory, which, quote, "preserves analog with it was seen as instant before from another angle. It anticipates what we'll see shortly." This synthesizes results in identification of objects, identification that never are completed, synthesizes that a subsequent sighting can always unsettle or undo. End quote. This is what our concept of the second analog would mean. The analog which conceptually absorbs the digital as an instrument with the help of which it conceptually reaches itself as the radical other. In this sense, the second analog would be logically the same, but analogically the other, the invented other in the self beyond the given self. In the end, we will return once again to the issue of the so-called post-pandemic life, the striking suggestiveness of this and every other period as a post-event makes us think of the second analog in its archetypal representation, that was of Noah's Ark. At the end of his prologue to the book named after this biblical story, Hubert Damisch reflects on the position of architecture in the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Albert. He says, quote, "The alphabetical order of encyclopedia called for the entry arc to come just a bit before the entry. Architecture was in the end neither force nor arbitrary. Architecture could only find the place after the flood, or rather in its stead." Thank you. Ok, sada možemo na srpskom, pretpostavljam, pošto smo svi sad tu, ja mislim,
Hvala, da vidim da li smo svi sa srpskog govornog, što se kaže. I think that we are not.
We are not, okay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for this unusual and interesting lecture. I would like to now open a discussion and questions maybe from the audience, both online and here in the presence. Let me just check.
Maybe we can discuss during the coffee break and
Absolutely.
Professor
Yeah,
Manuel.
exactly.
Right.
Let's just see for the beginning if someone online has a question, then if not, we can continue with the coffee break.
Yeah, everything is clear from our online point of view. Thank you for this interesting lecture, and greetings from Sarajevo.
Oh,
I hope you recorded it. Maybe it can be shared somewhere on the platform.
yes, the lecture is recorded and it will be shared.
Okay, great.
eventually.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Greetings, Sarajevo. Zenka. Okay, then if you like, we can have a coffee and discuss.